Hello, everybody. Welcome. You have arrived at the workshop from the Community-Based Research Training Center that's working out of the University of Winnipeg. It's wonderful to see you all, even in our virtual way. I'll start by acknowledging territory just to ground us back to where we all are, where we're doing our work, that we're on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Nihilwak, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples on Treaty 1 territory and homeland of the Métis Nation. I always like to just even think a little bit more about why it's so important, especially in terms of research. We're doing this work and interviewing with people in communities and understanding where we are in our responsibilities to territory as we do the work are really important. So just I would like to welcome everybody. If you've been part of the workshop series that we've been doing and attending, great to see you back. And if this is new to you, we hope you'll stay connected. We really are, this is our first year and we're really trying to engage with people and get people to be part of what we're doing. We really enjoy the work we're doing together. So Dagen Perrott is the coordinator for the Community-Based Research Training Center. So I'm going to pass it to him to be able to just set up the day and introduce our speakers and workshop presenters, I should say, Sarah Cooper and Jennifer Dengate. And I just realized I never told you, I'm Jeannie Kerr, and I'm at the University of Winnipeg, a faculty member. So great to see you all. And Dagen, if you could take it away.
Hi there, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. Few just housekeeping notes. If you have questions at any time during the next hour and a half, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll be monitoring that, and so I can answer them directly or make sure that they get to the speakers and presenters. We will be recording today's session. However, I will be only recording the presentation pieces, so any points where we're in breakout rooms or discussion, that will not be recorded. We will also be sending out the presentation slides after the workshop, as well as with a feedback form for folks to review. And I think this is going to be our last main workshop for the winter series. So again, thank you so much for coming. But we will try to do a few more like community building events over the next few months, and then we'll be back in fall with a new series. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And with all that, I would love to introduce Sarah Cooper and Jennifer Dengate to take it away.
Thank you, Dagen. My name is Sarah Cooper. I teach in city planning at the University of Manitoba. And my main research area is in housing and community development. So the kind of interviews and research work that I've done is mostly with nonprofit housing providers, interviewing them, and also community organizations. And then I've also done some research work where I've worked with community interviewers or peer interviewers to interview people within the community and build a research plan that way. So that gives you a little sense of where I'm coming from. And now I'll pass it over to Jennifer.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer. I am a social scientist. My PhD is in sociology and currently the director of the Center for Social Science Research and Policy at the University of Manitoba. So my research areas involve equity, diversity, and inclusion, and specifically looking at women's experiences working in male-dominated career settings and how women negotiate the integration of work and family. And so I'll speak to you today mostly about my very first interview experience, my dissertation research, which was about 6 years ago when I knew absolutely nothing and was terrified, and what I learned from that and what I hope I can teach you that will help you feel more comfortable conducting interviews.
As well, just going to launch a quick poll just to see what people's prior experience and interest in interviewing and transcription is. And while folks answer that, I'll do some troubleshooting here.
Great. Yeah, so if you have a moment, if you can take a moment to fill out this poll, that'll just give us a sense of who's here today, what your interests are, what your experience is, and that'll help us to make sure that we're able to answer your questions through this workshop. So while you're doing that, while you're working on the poll, let me just share my screen here and we'll tell you what we're going to talk about today. So we've done introductions, we've introduced ourselves. So the next thing we're going to talk about, Jen is going to talk a little bit about qualitative interviewing, things to consider before, during, and after the interview. And then we'll have a breakout session and debrief, an opportunity for you to chat in small groups, see if there are questions or comments that come up from that, and you can kind of interview each other about whether you have questions. Then we'll come back together, have a quick discussion, and then get into some factors around transcriptions and things to consider as you're beginning to think about data analysis of the interviews that you've just conducted. Then again, we'll have some breakout session time and then questions and wrap up. So that's kind of our plan for the day.
Awesome. And I think we have the poll results, so I'll share that here for everyone.
Great. Okay, so have people done qualitative research interviews before? About a quarter of the people have led research, a quarter have acted as research assistants. Again, another quarter have experienced transcribing interviews. About 1/5 of the people have not experienced with leading interviews, but have participated in interviews. And then another roughly quarter of the people have no experience with qualitative interviews. Okay, so that's a good mixture of people of experience levels. And then for what are you hoping to get out of this workshop? Large number of people just want to get more understanding about how interviews work, to build an understanding of, I can't see the whole question, but how to, I'm assuming that's how to transcribe. About 12% said they have specific questions on the topic, and about a quarter just want to know what interviewing and transcribing is all about. So that's great. Thank you for that. If you do have specific questions on the topic, maybe you can add them into the chat and we'll make sure that we get to them as we go along. Yeah, okay, Jennifer, are we ready to start with how to do interviews?
Yep, fire away.
All right, go back to sharing the screen.
Okay, so for everyone who may not be familiar with an interview research project, lots of steps involved. Unfortunately, we can't cover them all today. So today, I think Sarah and I will focus on number 5 and number 7 mostly. So conducting interviews, how that's done, what that might be like, and also giving you an introduction into how to analyze data, do some coding. So first off, what is a qualitative interview? So it's not just a conversation. And so when I say it's not just a conversation, what I mean is that it's not the type of conversation that you have when you're talking with a family or friend, right? So often when we're chatting with someone that we know, that we're familiar with in an informal way, we're still very focused on ourselves. We're thinking about what we're going to say in response, about our own experiences, and how to make ourselves look good. But when you're in an interview, your job is to make the person you're interviewing feel like the most important and interesting person in the world, because for the time that you're with them, they are. So of course, you're thinking of your follow-up questions, all of observations you're making in the room. All of those things are still focused around the person you're interviewing, however. And so while there are many different schools of thought around kind of epistemological issues about what an interview is and how the data that's gathered, I come from the school of thought that data is not passively gathered in an interview, it's actively co-produced by the interviewer and the interviewee. So you as the interviewer, you're influencing the data no matter what, because it's a social interaction, essentially. So different types of interviews, probably the 3 main ones are a survey interview, which is probably the most structured of the different types. So think of like filling out an online questionnaire. You want to hit every item in that order. Whereas semi-structured, just like the name implies, is a bit more flexible. And this is also called an in-depth interview. And I think that's mostly kind of the information that we'll present today is around semi-structured interviews. And that's what I conduct almost exclusively. There's also focus groups, which usually involves about 6 to 10 different people, or a group interview, which can be even 2 or 3. So in terms of when you would use each type, semi-structured or in-depth, probably for those topics that you want privacy around, so something personal or sensitive topics. Whereas a focus group, where you are going to benefit from having that group interaction with one another. So I always tend to think of those panels they have on like CNN around presidential elections, where you've got 6 or so people talking about the different candidates. So before we jump into the different stages of the interview process, just a few overarching issues that we wanted to touch on. So the first is power and positionality. So power dynamics are involved in any interview interaction, and they can be a two-way street. So you as the interviewer, you have control of the questions, the direction of the flow of the talk that you're having, but the person you're interviewing also may control when and where you meet and their responses to your questions, right? But there's also all these other asymmetries around socio-demographic characteristics, right? So your education credentials, income, racial, ethnic identities, gender identities, all these different things. And those differences can affect how the two of you interact, the different ways that questions are asked and answered. So for instance, does one of you consider the other person to be more of an authority figure? So in sociology, we say it's important to be reflexive when you're conducting an interview. So that's basically just considering which privileged and marginalized identity groups that you belong to in relation to those that you're interviewing. And just think about, is it biasing your interpretation of what's being shared or the questions that you're asking or even choosing not to ask in terms of probes and follow-ups? So just to be aware of your positionality. Also want to tell you to be mindful of safety and emotions. So safety, obviously, probably more important in the case of in-person interviews, but most importantly, just make sure you feel safe when you're conducting interviews. For instance, do you want to meet in public during the daytime as opposed to in a private residence if it's just you by yourself? Would you feel more comfortable if you were interviewing with a partner? Is that possible in the context of your study? And just bottom line, it's important to voice these concerns to your supervisors so that something can be worked out so that you're comfortable and the data can still be collected or produced. Also emotions, these are to be expected, so don't ignore them. So first of all, obviously on the part of the person you're interviewing, you want to notice how they're reacting to your questions. Watch their body language. Are they hesitant in responding to you? And other social cues that may indicate that they're not exactly comfortable with what's happening in the moment. But also pay attention to how you're feeling as well. You know, especially if the interview touches on sensitive or difficult topics, you are only human, you're not a robot. You know, it's understandable that if you're affected by what's being discussed as well.
And so building these questions about safety and emotions, we just wanted to highlight, especially for research assistants or people for whom this is new, to really work with your supervisor or a mentor who has experience with interviews, especially if you know that there's a risk of emotional topics arising during an interview, or if you have concerns ahead of time. It's good to have a plan in place for how to address these issues. So you want to, make sure that there are resources available to support the interviewee. You want to make sure to take care of your own emotional needs, as Jennifer said. And then also just talk to your supervisor if you have any concerns about your personal safety. If something goes wrong or goes weird during an interview, it may be, maybe it's expected that it could happen, or maybe it's not expected at all. And an example I can give of that, a few years ago, I was doing an interview with someone it was about policy. It was about urban planning policy, like land use planning. It was a very dry kind of topic, but the person had a lot going on in their life separate from this question of policy and planning, and they became very emotional and were crying, and I did not expect this at all. I had no plan in place to deal with it, and I it was very awkward, and so it made me really reflect on how even things that appear to be very dry, like policy, can still connect to things in people's lives in ways that we don't necessarily expect. And so having that plan to know how to support someone and how to access supports ourselves is important ahead of time. And then also, just if the interview questions aren't getting the answers you expected, it's important to follow up and check in with the supervisor or a research mentor who can help you figure out why that's happening. And especially if you're doing research within a university context, final accountability for the research rests with the Research Ethics Board. So making sure the Research Ethics Board is intended to make sure that the research is being conducted in an ethical way. And so they are also someone that you can reach out to if you have questions about ethics or emotions during interviews, like those kinds of things, but it's probably better to start with your supervisor or a research mentor. And then, as needed, reach out further.
All right, so before the interview, my biggest piece of advice is to prepare and practice. So you want to make sure first and foremost, you know the final interview guide or the question list well prior to you sitting down. So when you sit down to conduct your interview, that should not be the first time you're seeing the questions or the order that they're in. And so this is why a pilot test is really important. So for those who may not be familiar, pilot test is basically a trial run where you interview people that are similar to those who are going to be in your study, but who won't be part of the final sample for your study. So you want to find people that are like those who will end up in the final study sample, because it'll help you judge which questions are effective or ineffective, where you need to make adjustments. So if your research project is involved on, high school students, it doesn't make sense for you to do a pilot test on 30 to 40-year-old professionals, right? Because the relevance will be very different. Also want to know the details of the study, if you can, because people will have questions when you sit down. So they want to know, why are you doing this? Why are you interested? What's the purpose of the research? And also ask you about ethical issues. Like for instance, if they have concerns around confidentiality and anonymity.
Northern Manhattan.
So for instance, you might have to explain to them, okay, well, if I use a quote from you, I'm going to use a pseudonym, which is the fake name, so that no one will be able to identify you. Also want to make sure to test your audio recorder to make sure it works. Very important. So you do your own trial run, and then you'll hate hearing your voice when you play it back. I still have issues with that to this day, but it's just something that you have to get over. And also have a backup plan. If something goes wrong, it just doesn't work, you may just have to take notes for that particular interview. It happens, say la vie. And if we're talking about in-person interviews, make sure you have extra copies of everything. Hopefully you won't need it, but if something happens, you're taken care of. So have an extra copy of the questions, of the consent forms, pens, batteries, all that stuff. Along with preparing and practicing, scheduling was probably the biggest lesson I learned when I first started interviewing, how time consuming it can be. You need to start early. So if you have a hard deadline, start as early as possible, because you will have to reschedule and reschedule again, probably several times for certain people. So vividly remember being left, stood up outside of coffee shops, office buildings, downtown Vancouver, in front of people's houses. It is going to happen, even if you confirm that the interview is still going on, right? So my favorite memory was conducting my dissertation interviews. I'd interviewed this woman once before already, showed up at her house, rang the doorbell, knocked on the door, no one was answering, waiting around for like 20, 30 minutes. Finally, I gave up and went home, connected with her later and found out her and her family had recently moved across the city, just didn't tell me. And so, that's it, it will happen. Just have to roll with it, basically. Honestly, those are the experiences that I'm most grateful for, because they taught me to be more flexible when it comes to conducting research, that it's not like you read in the textbook, that things will go wrong. You just have to adjust in the moment and that it will still be okay. You also want to be flexible and accommodating if possible. So these people are doing you a favor by sitting down to speak with you. So if possible, meet them when and where they prefer, but also keeping in mind, you need to have good sound quality for transcription. And also there may be confidentiality concerns. Is that person comfortable if someone overhears what they're saying, if you're in like a coffee shop or something like that? Also use their preferred method if you can, if they'd rather do something over the phone rather than in person, or now we're mostly doing video conference type situations. Also, another important lesson I learned is to not overschedule yourself, especially if we're talking about having to travel between interviews. So when I did my dissertation, I was in Vancouver, I didn't have a car, I was having to take public transit between interviews. Sometimes that could take an hour to get from one place to another. So things to remember, especially if you want to reserve time to write notes while your experiences are fresh in between interviews. So less of a concern when you're doing things remotely, but also very surprised to learn how physically and mentally tiring it can be to conduct interviews, especially if you're conducting in-depth, which can be like 1 to 2 hours long. So you're doing many things at once, which we'll get into in the next section. You can see how mentally taxing it might end up being. Another reason not to overschedule yourself. I think I found I could only do 2 in one day when I was doing my dissertation. So during the interview process, start out by saying that rapport building and these softer skills really do matter. Because as the second bullet point notes, people have to want to talk to you and feel comfortable sharing things about their lives. You have to really quickly build a relationship with basically a stranger. And this can be especially important if the other person is quite different from you, right? So if you're a middle-class white female who's interviewing, an older recent immigrant to Canada or a First Nations elder, you need to take some time to invest in building that relationship as quickly as you can, given the amount of time you have with that person. So even simple things like dressing and presenting yourself appropriately based on who you're interviewing and what the setting is. So for instance, interviewed new mothers who are on maternity leave. I didn't show up dressed to the nines, right? I showed up in a jeans, t-shirt, hoodie, little or no makeup on. And I did that so that these new mothers who had, 3-month-old infants who aren't sleeping, barely have time to shower, maybe dealing with postpartum health issues, that they're not focused on what their appearance is. They're just, basically, I'm just a neighbor who popped by to have a cup of coffee and talk with them for a bit. But when these mothers went back to their jobs full-time, their paid work, I wouldn't dress like that. I would wear trousers, a nice sweater, just so that would fit in their work settings too. Also make sure to, or you can start off slow. You don't have to go jump right into it, right down to business. You can ease in with some get to know you or non-threatening questions at the beginning of the interview to help you build that rapport. So one example that I always remember is interviewing a new mother in her home. They had a really awesome 1950s vintage red stove. And I was like, oh, I love your stove. And we just talked about that for 5 or so minutes so that you can just be comfortable. So the takeaway is you can be personable and professional. Okay, so during the interview, again, you're doing many things simultaneously. You are listening, you're observing your surroundings, you're thinking of follow-ups, monitoring how they're reacting to your questions, a lot of mental work. But the most important thing is that you have to listen. That's where you need to invest most of your time. So if you're going to speak, it should only be about 10 to 20% of the time, ideally. You want the other person to be speaking 80 to 90% of the time. Probably going to ask 3 main types of questions in your interview. The first are your predetermined questions for your interview guide and question list, so they're already there for you. Second type are probes, so this is to elicit additional detail or explore the implications of the responses that you're getting. So simple things like, just can you tell me more about that? How so? In what way? But often the most effective type of probe is just straight up silence. Because once you're quiet and you want them to talk more, it creates a bit of discomfort because people want to fill that silence, and so they'll tend to start talking more and give you more details. And then lastly, your follow-ups. So do you want to further pursue a topic that the interviewee may have introduced? And this is really important in semi-structured interviewing, where the whole point is that you want the person you're interviewing to introduce new topics that the research team may not have thought of when they put the interview guide together. So essentially what you're doing is positioning or presenting yourself as what's called the socially acceptable incompetent. So you pretend like you don't understand so that the person will explain things to you in their own words. It can be really helpful to bring a list of prompts and probes with you when you're first starting out. It will become easier with practice, but if you're just starting out, you may want that just in case. And this is also why pilot testing is important. It can start to give you some experience in following up and probing in the moment. You also want to remain neutral or non-judgmental during the interview, so don't offer your opinions in response to their answers. Also show you're actively listening, make eye contact, and show you're engaged with what they're saying. So you can do little things, right? Like you nod your head, make occasional verbal reactions, right? Oh, I understand, right? But again, try not to speak as much as possible. Also try not to fidget or engage in distracting behaviors. So this was a hard lesson I learned when I was first starting out. So in conducting my pilot tests, I learned that I had been checking my watch because I was very worried that I didn't have enough time to ask all my questions. And so the person I was interviewing for that test run said, you did that often. And so when I went to go do my actual interviews, I left my watch at home. So it wasn't even a temptation for me. Nowadays it'll be your phone, but. Also really helpful to take notes in the moment. So what I would do, because I'm old school, I would print out a hard copy, just a Word document. I'd write all my questions out, but leave big spaces of white so that I could take notes right underneath the question that I had just asked. Can you remind yourself to probe and follow up on specific things that they've said? Also helps you jot down events and details that won't necessarily be picked up by your audio recorder, but that may really enhance your analysis. So one of my research questions was asking how mothers who went on leave, did they totally leave their jobs behind for that year-long period? And so one mother that I interviewed was in her bedroom. Her home office was 3 feet away from her bed. So there was really no separation between work and home. And that really mirrored her leave experience because she worked on leave and went back to work full time at about 3 months. So it was really helpful for my analysis when I was recalling that interview and could set the stage more visually. That being said, don't worry about writing everything down because that can signal that you might be disinterested in what the interviewee is saying. So just try to strike a balance. You will get off topic or irrelevant responses. It's going to happen. So when that does happen, you try your best to gently and politely redirect back to your list of questions. One experience I will never forget, I sat down and asked my first question, and it was half an hour before my interviewee had stopped speaking. I tried so hard to find a natural break in the conversation to redirect, but it just wasn't working. I was just starting out, so it was really freaking me out mentally. I was like, I'm not gonna have time to get through all my questions. My analysis is gonna be bad. I'm gonna fail my dissertation, just mentally spiraling out. But when I look back on it, to think, she trusted me enough. She needed someone to vent to. This was a new mom who, she needed someone to talk to. She was having money problems, all these different things that she needed to get off her chest. And so looking back, while that interview wasn't maybe terrific in terms of analysis, I was still able to get something from it. And you just learn that, one bad interview or two isn't going to wreck the whole project. So when you have the opportunity, some cases it's better to protect the rapport that you've built with the person than try to force them back into the question list. Consistency is also something that's important. So slight variations in the question wording are going to be normal because it's just human nature. But you want to try to ask the questions as they're written because in many cases they've been reviewed and approved by a research ethics board. And generally, you also want to ask the same questions each interview because you need to compare the responses later when it comes to analysis. And so some variation is expected. And just the caveat is that, for semi-structured interviewing, there's going to be a lot more variation as opposed to a different type of format. Because again, the whole point of that is because you want the person being interviewed to introduce new things that are maybe unexpected to you because you don't have the same lived experience as they have. Also, confirmation in the interview, understanding that you accurately understand what the person has said is really helpful if you can do that in real time. So if they give you an answer, oh, it sounds to me like you consider, football to be super boring. Is that right? You can interpret their response and say it back to them in their own words, and they can directly say yes or no. So again, at the transcription stage, you've got that confirmation right there for you so that you're not left wondering or unsure. Also great to end with an open question, like, is there anything else that you would like to add? Often this is everyone's kind of relaxed at this point, you're comfortable with one another, and this can elicit the most interesting responses. But it's also an important thing to add at the end because it allows the interviewee to point out things you may have missed, details that they neglected to mention earlier, things they remembered along the way, or often they may have had time to rethink something they said earlier. So this way they can clarify or rephrase something so that, you're presenting them in the most accurate way. After the interview, write and review your notes. Listen to your audio recordings and write down observations. Following each interview as soon as possible. Like I said, everyone's different. I tried to do it immediately after, but sometimes life just gets in the way. But try to do it, within 24, 48 hours at the latest, I would recommend. This reflection period allows you to identify questions that you want to add or subtract from the question list, if that's possible. Again, that's something that's expected in semi-structured, but it may be different for other research projects. Also lets you identify the instances where you failed to probe or follow up, or even when you asked a really great follow-up that you want to use again next time. I did that often. Would often pencil in probes or follow-ups from one interview to the other, just write them in on the next guide that I was taking to my next interview. Also a good idea to reflect on your own process and habits. You know, are you finding it easy to think of probes in the moment? Are you having trouble with that? Do you get flustered and pose very unclear follow-ups that causes you to have to explain a lot and kind of interrupts the flow of the conversation? And also just reflect on how the interview went as a whole, but really important to be honest with yourself. Again, no one's an expert when they first start out. It takes time to get comfortable. So the more you do, the better you get at interviewing. You know, did the respondents answer the questions that you posed to them? If not, you know, why not? And most importantly, what are you going to do differently next time that will hopefully improve the quality of the next interview?
All right. So you can see the screen now? Okay. So transcription. So once you've done all of your interviews, you've got all the recordings, what is transcription? It's the process of converting that audio file to a written record. And this gives you a body of data that you can then analyze. So the goal is to be able to analyze the data and to identify quotes to, you know, support your findings. And in order to do that, you need to have this transcription and then do the process of analysis. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can do the transcription. You can do it yourself. You can hire a professional transcriber, or there are also like online audio to text tools. And you can see that actually happening right now with the PowerPoint. There's this automatic function that is able to transcribe the words that I'm saying. As you can also probably tell, it doesn't always work 100%. So you always need to scan through it and check it, but it's an option. So what are some factors to consider if you're choosing how to do this? First is time. It takes 2 to 3 hours of transcribing for each hour of interviewing. So that can be really good motivation to keep the interview short. There's a cost to it. If you're paying a professional, it often costs about $25 for each hour of transcribing. So at 2 to 3 hours per hour of interviewing, that's about $75, which it can add up. So do you have funds for that? Also, confidentiality. If someone else is doing the transcribing for you, will they maintain whatever confidentiality is required under ethics? This is especially a concern for these online audio to text transcribers. If the data server is located in the US, there's issues around the Department of Homeland Security having access to all online files. I don't really know a whole lot about it, but it's something to consider. Does that apply to your research? Is that something that you would be concerned about? And then there are benefits to doing it yourself. So you'll develop a deeper understanding of the data and you'll be able to get a head start on the analysis, just because the more you read through and engage with the interviews, the more you'll be thinking about them and analyzing the data. So what are some practical considerations for transcribing? First of all, you need to anticipate the transcription in the interview. So Jennifer talked about a whole bunch of factors to consider in the interviews. Some of these apply to transcription. If you can do the interview in a quiet place, that will make the sound quality much better. Have a good microphone, also makes the sound quality better. Don't interrupt or talk over the interviewee. That also helps with sound. It's really all about sound quality, making sure that the audio is as clear as possible. And ask clarifying questions. So if there's something that is not maybe as clear as it could be, follow up. And then for transcribing, using foot pedals and being able to control the playback speed, it's very important, it's very useful. Usually for transcribing, we're playing the audio maybe on a computer and typing into, say, a Word document. With foot pedals, you can go back, you can rewind, you can fast forward without having to switch between different programs and all of that. And being able to slow down how quickly people speak makes it a lot easier to type at the same speed. So that is like my number one tip. Have a foot pedal and control the speed of the playback. Also in your document, include any basic information that's needed up front. So the name of the person or the pseudonym of the interviewee, the date of the interview, the location, any other relevant information that you want to make sure you have right up at the top. And then also have a policy for how you're going to deal with confidential or potentially identifying information. So when you go through an ethics process, you'll need to determine how you're going to maintain confidentiality for your interviewees. So for example, you may not use the interviewees' names in your final report. But when people are talking, they often use indirectly identifying information. So they might talk about places that they've lived or that they hang out. They might talk about their children or their children's names. They might talk about friends. And from that information, you might be able to indirectly identify them. And to give an example of this, a few years ago, there was a report here in Winnipeg about someone who lived in poor quality housing, and there was a fire, and there were, all these details in the report. It didn't use the person's name, but it took me about 3 minutes on the internet to find a news article about the fire, and I was able to identify the person's name from that. So just thinking ahead of time how you're going to identify, how you're going to deal with that kind of information is important. A few more things to think about. When you're transcribing, you want to have as much detail as possible in the transcript. That'll give you more data to analyze later. So include as much as possible and be as precise as possible. Inevitably, at some point, you won't be able to hear something or understand something. So what do? Play it again, play it faster, play it slower, walk away, come back, ask a friend. There's a lot of options. And then if you really, really can't understand it, you can put square brackets and inaudible. And that'll show, in the transcript that there's a piece, a word or a sentence that you just couldn't hear. The most important thing is to be consistent in how you're transcribing and to be as clear as possible. So some factors to consider ahead of time before you start transcribing are how you're going to deal with things that come up in general conversation. So most of us use filler words. I know I do a lot. I say ums, ahs, you knows. How will you deal with those in a transcript? You don't always have to include them, but you need to be consistent in whether you're including them or not. How will you deal with phrasing? Sometimes people say things awkwardly. I have a tendency to interrupt myself. I talk in half sentences because I have a new idea in the middle of a sentence. Somebody for whom English is not their first language may say things that are different from, a kind of standard English way of saying it. How will you engage with those things in the transcript? How about pauses? How about emotions? If someone starts laughing or crying, if somebody decides that they want to emphasize something either by whispering or by shouting loudly, how will these be reflected in the transcript? And it's not that they necessarily have to be, but again, it's about consistency so that you can conduct your analysis as clearly as possible. If people gesture, you might be doing an interview about, I don't know, like a children's playground, and someone might point over in that corner is where this happened. Is there a way to engage or to include that gesture in the transcript? And then also other languages. You may be conducting a whole interview in a different language, or you may be speaking to someone who includes words from other languages in their speaking. So how are you going to address that in the transcript? How do you engage with that? So just a whole bunch of things to consider. Again, it doesn't matter too much how you engage with them, how you deal with them, but it's important to be as consistent as possible across your transcripts. So that's transcribing. And then once you have your transcripts, then you can start coding. And coding is the process of identifying and labeling themes and content for the analysis that's within the interviews. So we have, the process of coding, and then we also have codes. So codes are the specific words or phrases that summarize the themes or the content of interest. And I have an example of this in a couple of slides, so to make it a little more visible, I guess. And then, so all the codes together fit into a coding framework. So this is the lens through which you examine all of your transcripts. The purpose of coding is so that you look at each transcript or each interview using the same lens so that you're interpreting them the same way. So how do you do this? You read through and code your transcripts at least 3 to 4 times. Each time you go through, you'll see new things, new ideas will come up. And so it's important to make sure you don't just go through once and be like, one and done. No, that's not going to work. And then also write notes and memos as you go. So as you start this process of coding, you can start to connect back to things that you may have read about in your lit review, or things that you know, in one interview, you may think, oh, well, that connects to this idea from another interview. Start taking those notes as you go along, and that'll help you with your writing up your analysis once you get to that stage. So there are 2 main kinds of memos that we write. The first are methodological memos, where we reflect on the process or the methodology of the research. So what's going well, what's not going well, what do I need to change? How do I, as the interviewer, reflect on this process? And then the second one is theoretical or conceptual memos. So reflections on how the findings or the code, what's emerging through the coding process, how do these connect to the theories or the concepts that the research is examining? So what's come up in your literature review, connections between different interviews, all that kind of stuff. So developing codes, you might have specific words that you're looking for. So my research area is housing. So I might, listen for people who are talking, who use the word, for example, affordable specifically. But you might also have broader themes. So people might, rather than listening for somebody to say the word affordable specifically, I might listen for somebody who's talking about the concept of affordability. Someone might say, I can't afford this, or I can't, my income isn't high enough, and that would still be a matter of, it would still relate to this idea of affordability. So we've got content, specific words, and then also themes, so ideas or broader concepts. And these can come from or emerge in 2 different ways. First, we have preset or deductive codes, and these are developed from the research questions and then literature review. So before you start coding your data, you will already have these kinds of codes in place. The second kind of codes are called emergent or inductive codes, and these arise as you review the interviews, as you're reading through and doing the coding. And these are things that maybe didn't come up in the literature review, but that turn out to be important themes throughout your research. And again, consistency is very important in the coding process. So you would develop a code key, where you define your codes. What do they mean? In order to ensure that you apply the codes consistently across all of the interviews. It's possible if you don't do this, they can kind of drift, and that's not helpful for the analysis. And then again, if new codes emerge, it's important to review all of the transcripts. So if you have 20 transcripts and you're on interview number 10 and you realize here's a new code that I need to really think of, you have to go back to number 1 and make sure that you review all of those again for all of the codes. So let's look at an example of this. So this is a question. The research question here might be, what are some barriers that low-income tenants in Winnipeg face in accessing good quality housing, and what are strategies that they use in order to improve their living situation? So from the literature, we might find that the cost of available housing is important, the quality of available housing is important, and the size of the housing that is relative to the household is also important. And then the strategies, we might find that people, or from the literature, that people use sharing housing or living with roommates. They move to better quality housing whenever the opportunity presents itself, and they advocate for better quality housing. So these would be our codes. We would go through each interview looking for these themes through each interview. But then those are the preset or deductive. We might also have emergent or inductive codes that would come up through the interviews. So for example, under barriers to accessing good housing, we might also hear about racism and discrimination from landlords. And we might also hear about the need for housing that meets accessibility needs. So those are two kind of emergent themes that we might want to then go back and review all of our interviews for. Similarly, under strategies used to improve living, we already had the subcode of advocacy, but maybe we would want to divide that into two different kinds of advocacy. So people might go and work with community organizations. They might find support and advocacy through that. And they may also advocate for themselves, two different kinds of advocacy. So that's just an example of some codes of a coding framework. So 4 main kind of technical approaches to doing coding. There's probably more, but these are the ones that I'm going to mention. First of all, there are computer programs that are specifically developed to apply codes. There's In Vivo, that's probably the most well-known one. Deduce, there's a bunch of others. You can also do coding in an Excel spreadsheet where you would put, maybe all your interviews in one column and all your codes across the top, and then cut and paste examples into the spreadsheet from each interview for the codes. And then you can also do it in Word. You can have 2 columns, one with your interview data in it and the second with codes, just kind of like paralleling them whenever they come up. You can also use comments for the codes, and that's actually an example that you can see here on the screen. This person has coded both, words and large sections with different codes. And then you can also do it manually. This is like the old school way to do it. Pull out a bunch of colored pencils, highlighters, and choose one color for each code, and just, read through and highlight anything that relates to a particular code. Which option you choose depends on personal preference and how your brain works, kind of, but also how many codes how many interviews you have. So if you have a small number of interviews, manual is probably easy. It's a good way to do it. If you have like 500 interviews, you probably don't want to manually code everything. You probably want to use something more like In Vivo that will enable you to do more of that complex high-level analysis. But it all depends on what your specific project is.